We're going to kick off the morning with a very important topic. We're all going to tune in and give our attention and learn a lot about something that is affecting a lot of us. And to get things started, I'm going to bring back up our Executive Director, Rob Cadill, to introduce the subject. Here's Rob.
Brothers, good morning. All right, we're picking up, we're warming up a little bit. I appreciate you heeding our advice last night. This is a pretty good room this morning, which is appropriate because we're here to learn, we're here to better ourselves, we're here to better our chapters. I told you last night we're going to challenge you. I told you we're going to challenge you this weekend to think hard, to take that real tough look in the mirror. That starts especially this morning. As emphasized by our program last night, Phi Gamma Delta is committed to ending self-destructive behaviors and is firmly committed in its stance that hazing directly contradicts our values and has absolutely no place in our fraternity. For anyone in this room who might believe that your chapter needs hazing to make it successful, for anyone in this room who feels like they have someone in their chapter who feels like they need hazing to make your chapter what you think it should be, start listening right now. Hazing is a con. It's a power grab by the weak, by bullies, and a myth that by forcing two new members to prove their worth, it will build a strong chapter. The realities are that hazing divides chapters, it builds resentment, results in weak chapters where only a few are truly engaged. The reality, too, is that hazing is much more serious and has much more significant consequences. Chapters are closed. Members are expelled from Phi Gamma Delta and from their institutions. And in a growing number of cases, those individuals face criminal prosecution. Hazing is a crime, and Phi Gamma Delta wholeheartedly endorses and advocates for the strongest criminal penalties possible for those who choose to haze. You're not hiding in the shadows anymore. Those who haze are not in the shadows. You're coming to the limelight to cleanse us of this issue that we face. I am done with it. We are done with it. We are not going to tolerate it anymore. But the reality is, even with all that, there are much more significant consequences because very tragically, hazing can be deadly. Max Gruver's parents described him as a gentle giant. He was a sports fanatic and wrote for a sports website even before starting as a journalism major at LSU. Just weeks into his first semester, Max tragically died after being forced to consume 190 proof alcohol in a chapter hazing activity. Tim Piazza dreamed of one day helping children and veterans through the development of state-of-the-art prosthetics. His parents described him as a loving kid who invested in the relationships with his family, with his friends, and with his girlfriend. Yet, at age 19, Tim passed away after a chapter hazing ritual. He was forced to drink at least 18 drinks in over an hour and a half, and he suffered catastrophic injuries after a fall. So joining us this morning are four parents, brave individuals, Jim and Evelyn Piazza, and Steve and Rae Ann Gruver, who have faced the worst scenario imaginable that a parent can possibly see. They've seen their sons die, and now they're actively working to fight hazing, the hazing which took their sons' lives. Both the Piazzas and the Gruvers have been named recipients of the Hank Newer Anti-Hazing Award for their commitment to end hazing, and have been staunch advocates to strengthen legislation against this dreadful activity. Adding some additional insight into today's program is a familiar face to Phi Gamma Delta, and that is Dr. Gentry McCreary, CEO and managing partner of Dyad Strategies. Dyad, by the way, is a consulting firm which helps college campuses and fraternal organizations like Phi Gamma Delta to really improve and measure the impact of their work. Now, Gentry's award-winning research examines the roots of fraternity hazing, the moral development of college students, and the roots of fraternal brotherhood and sisterhood, the things that matter most. Brothers, please join me in welcoming to the stage Rae Ann and Steve Gruver, Tim and Evelyn Piazza, and Dr. Gentry McCreary.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for sharing your time with us today. During our time together, we are going to talk to you about hazing, what hazing looks like, what to watch out for, and what you can do to keep yourself and your friends safe. Hazing should never be a part of your college experience or the college experience of any of your friends. This presentation is an honor and loving memory of our sons, Max Gruver and Tim Piazza, who both died because of hazing in their fraternities.
Good luck at your first semester of college.
We hope that you have a great first year at school.
Have a good time and learn a lot about yourself.
Make new friends and have fun.
Make us proud and study hard.
Make good decisions and be safe.
Love, Mom and Dad.
His lips are purple, his body's extremely stiff, and I can't wake him up, and I honestly, I don't feel a pulse.
19-year-old male is not conscious, not breathing. They believed it may be alcohol poisoning.
Every year for the past 2 decades, at least one young man in the U.S. has died in connection with fraternity hazing.
Hazing has killed at least one person a year since 1961.
As many as 6 college students lost their lives in the last year in alcohol-fueled hazing rituals.
Michael Dang died 2 years ago after a brutal beating from his frat brothers.
A team of frat guys tackling pledges as they tried to cross a pitch-dark field. They didn't let up, it says, until Harrison was wheezing on the ground.
Sons County 911, where's your emergency? Hello, I think my friend drank a little too much.
Pledges were asked questions about the fraternity. Knockin and 2 others forced them to drink 190 proof alcohol when they got the answers wrong.
Okay, is he responsive?
He was, and then he's kind of laid back, started passing out.
Okay, is he still breathing?
A lawsuit claims he'd been asked to drink an entire bottle of 101 proof bourbon.
Piazza and 13 other Beta Theta Pi pledges participated in a drinking challenge called the Gauntlet, consuming 4 to 5 drinks in just 2 minutes. Piazza then reportedly suffering a catastrophic fall down a flight of stairs. 12 hours after Piazza's fall, the first call for help.
What's going on today?
We have a friend who's unconscious. He hasn't moved. He's cold extremity. It's probably needing an ambulance.
18-year-old Colin Wyant was found dead after being subjected to shocking hazing abuse, including being beaten with a belt, forced to drink a half-gallon of vodka in 60 minutes, and forced to inhale nitrous oxide.
We're just at a point where we're trying to figure out how do you convince these very intelligent millennials that people are dying every year because of these behaviors.
Instead of dialing 911, the report says the brothers were using their phones to search for the phrases falling asleep after head injury, and a few minutes later, binge drinking, alcohol, bruising or discoloration, cold feet and cold hands.
And we received that knock on the door from the police officer at 5:30 in the morning. That will forever be the moment that divided everything in all of our lives.
He passed away there that night, probably between midnight and 1 a.m. They didn't call 911 until almost 9 o'clock in the morning.
Well, if we don't do something, it definitely is not going to end. You're just not supposed to bury your kids.
The nurse brought me forward and told me to kiss him goodbye. It was hard. And that's what you think of when you close your eyes.
They need to step up if they see something is wrong. Don't be scared. You could possibly be saving somebody's life.
There were an estimated 100 people at that party, and 99 of them didn't help my son. Andrew died in a room full of people that just didn't care.
Max. Let me tell you all a little bit about my Max. Max was a gentle giant. He was a sweet soul. He had a big smile and an even bigger hug. And he was always someone who took care of the people around him. He was easygoing and super laid back. He laughed with his entire body, and he loved every day of his life. Max was born and raised in Roswell, Georgia, and is the older brother to Alex, who was just 16, and Lily Kate, who was just 12 when Max died. He went to Blessed Trinity Catholic High School. He dated this beautiful girl, Blakely, all 4 years. He loved sports, journalism, and he loved rap music. Max also wrote sports articles for Def Pen Radio, writing over 360 articles in just 3 years. He could talk your ear off about any sport and all the statistics to go with it. Max was a Little League coach, and he coached his sister's basketball team. Max chose LSU because he liked the journalism program, and he knew he had a lot of possibilities ahead of him. He had a bright future, one he was ready to go after. He pledged to fraternity, to meet people, and to get involved at a really big school. And he was also interested in a fraternity where he could take on a leadership role. He'd even been up for pledge class president. Max was ready to start the next chapter of his life, but the next chapter of his life would be very short-lived. We dropped Max off on August 15th, 2017. This picture is the last picture I have of my son and I. It's a moment I will never forget. It's a moment many of you probably had with your parents when they dropped you off, especially that freshman year. But it was the last time I felt his arms around me, giving me that huge hug. It was the last time I saw that enormous smile. It was the last time I was able to look at him in the eyes, tell him I loved him, that I would miss him, and that I was really, really proud of him. I told him, "This is your time. Go shine your light on the world." But 29 days later, my son would be dead because of alcohol hazing in his fraternity house. According to police reports and trial testimony, pledges were summoned to the house for Bible study. They arrived at 10 p.m. on a Wednesday night, and their phones were taken from them. Some brothers descended down the stairs to where the pledges were playing pool, and one said, "Are you all ready for Bible study? Y'all better do well, because I'm already effed up." The pledges were then placed in a single file line, and they were marched up the stairs as they were doused in hot sauce and in mustard. They were placed in a dark hallway with a flashing strobe light and loud blaring music, clearly intended to disorient and distract the participants. At one point, the pledges were told to do wall sits where brothers walked or ran across their legs. At another point, a pledge was accidentally struck in the eye with a liquor bottle, causing a severe black eye and laceration. But the big part of the night was Bible study. Pledges were placed with their noses and their toes against the wall, and that's when the questions began. Answer a question wrong about the fraternity history, or mess up on the Greek alphabet, and you have to take a pull off of a liquor bottle. The liquor of choice for this Bible study was diesel, and a pull is taking a swing off that bottle until you are told to stop while brothers are screaming at you and telling you how long you need to drink off that bottle. Some pledges were forced to drink up to 10 seconds from those liquor bottles. Max was one of those pledges. And as I think many of you may know, and for those of you that don't, diesel is not just alcohol. It is what is called a high-potency alcohol. It's an alcoholic beverage that is 2.5 times stronger than an alcoholic beverage that is more familiar to the average person, like rum or vodka. This particular alcohol is 190 proof alcohol, grain alcohol. The alcohol's own website includes this warning, and I quote, "Diesel 190 proof is extremely potent and should not be drunk straight, but integrated with drinks in a small amount." According to witnesses, this pledge activity lasted less than 2 hours, and Max was forced to consume at least 18 to 20 pulls off of those liquor bottles, which has been calculated to be over 32 ounces of 190 proof alcohol. Max was forced to take significantly more pulls than other pledges because he was clearly getting answers wrong, and he had been late to some other hazing events, and certain fraternity members had singled him out. They singled him out. The actions taken by these hazers because Max was late to other events resulted in my son's death. Near the end of the event, Max was observed to have a puke bag tied around his neck, but the hazers decided to make the pledges still go on and recite the Greek alphabet as they went down the line, each one saying one letter of the alphabet, and if anyone messed up, that person had a drink, and then they all had to start back over again. Every time they got to Max, Max messed up. He couldn't remember upsilon. It was the only letter of the Greek alphabet that he had to remember. But with a puke bag tied around his neck and obviously clearly intoxicated, he was still forced to drink 5 to 6 more pulls off of those diesel bottles. Max was taken back downstairs and left to sleep it off on a couch. And even with obvious signs of distress, no one called 911 to render Max aid during the night, something that could have saved his life. The brothers observed him with labored breathing, with cold, clammy skin, with his lips and his fingers turning blue, and a weak pulse. Even checking his pulse and checking his breathing and still not calling 911. My son died at some point the morning of September 14th. He did not wake up in the morning with a weak pulse like many news reports initially said. The autopsy showed that Max died on that couch between 5 and 6 a.m. And the brothers, who were more concerned about themselves and getting in trouble than saving my son's life, it was stated that they cleaned up the house, they got rid of most of those diesel bottles, and they even cleaned up Max. And then in the morning, when students were in their morning classes, the brothers called Max's pledge brothers out of their classes to come get Max. They told the pledges to lie about how and where they found Max. And then they had 4 of Max's pledge brothers, 4 of his closest friends, pick up Max's dead body, carry it out of the house, put it in a truck, and drive him to the hospital. Never calling 911 and telling the pledges that Max was still alive and they could make it. Max's blood alcohol concentration was an alarming 0.495. I say alarming because this is 6 times the legal limit at which a person is considered legally impaired, like a DUI. Even more alarming is that a blood alcohol concentration of higher than 0.31 is considered life-threatening. Can you really call this a brotherhood? Subjecting new members to life-threatening hazing rituals like this? Tragically, our son died as a result of this alcohol hazing Bible study. He was left to sleep it off in the fraternity house with his brothers right there, and the outcome was fatal. The coroner cited the cause of death as acute alcohol intoxication with aspiration. Max literally choked to death on his own vomit. 10 fraternity members have been arrested on criminal charges ranging from hazing to negligent homicide, which is a felony. 4 were indicted by a grand jury. 2 have pleaded no contest, which is the same as a guilty plea in Louisiana, and they were sentenced to 30 days in jail. The individual, who was charged with negligent homicide, was also found guilty of his crime. He was sentenced to up to 5 years in jail. So many lives have been ruined because of hazing. But most of all, our family has to live every single day without our oldest son, without a brother, without a grandson, without a cousin, a best friend, a boyfriend. This is not the college experience that we, or I think any of you in this room, are looking for.
Tim was an amazing person with an incredible sense of humor. He was shy until he got to know you, and then he was larger than life. He was smart, athletic, loved Netflix and video games, and he kind of had his life figured out. He was going to major in mechanical engineering so he could have a career designing prosthetics, go to grad school, eventually marry his high school sweetheart, and just have fun with his brother and friends. This is our last family picture taken together at the Rose Bowl, January 2nd in 2017. It happens to be our anniversary. That year when Penn State qualified for the Rose Bowl, Tim asked if we could go. And he didn't normally ask for things. So we thought about it and we thought we'll make a trip out of it. We'll make a family vacation. We live in New Jersey, the Rose Bowl's in California. We'll go for the week. But Tim had qualifications. He needed to be home on New Year's Eve to be with his girlfriend, and he needed to come back the day after the game so he could finish out his winter internship that week. So it was an expensive, not even 3 days, and it was the best money that we ever spent because a month later, Tim was dead. Tim was a part of his girlfriend's family. He was the big brother to Caitlin's younger brother and sister, and he was there for them if they needed him or wanted him for anything. He was loved, trusted, and appreciated far more than he ever knew. They were devastated by his death. Tim was a big guy, and he took on the role of protector for anyone who needed it. He was a great friend, brother, and boyfriend. He brought lightness to any room, making people smile and laugh. My favorite picture is the one to the right. That, to me, is pure contentment. They truly were perfect for each other.
So let me set the stage. On February 2nd, 2017, Tim received a text message telling him to report to the fraternity house by 9:30 p.m. wearing khakis and a blazer. He was also told, "Don't be late, and we're going to get you fucked up." Upon arrival at the house, he and other pledges were greeted with a small ceremony, and then they were handed a handle of vodka and were told that they had to finish it before moving on. Simple math would tell you on average each pledge had around 3.5 shots from that handle in just a matter of minutes. After finishing the handle, they were lined up behind a door, and one by one were allowed through the door, where they encountered a drinking obstacle course, which was called the Gauntlet, which had several stations in which pledges were told to do beer shotguns, drink from wine bags, have more shots of vodka, there was a beer pong challenge, and other things. The pledges were being screamed at and pushed along through the obstacle course. The obstacle course was followed by a so-called celebratory event in the basement, where the pledges were continued to be handed bottles of vodka, wine bags, and more beers to drink. All of this was captured on video. The video showed that in less than 90 minutes, Tim had the equivalent of 18 drinks. Shortly after 11 p.m., Tim went upstairs with another fraternity member who then left him alone. Tim tried to figure out how to leave the house, but he couldn't even figure out how to open the door. The fraternity member left him alone, and it's shown on video, he's stumbling around, and eventually went back to the basement steps, which is where he fell headfirst down 15 steps. 4 brothers were immediately seen carrying his limp body back upstairs, and they threw him on a couch. He was out cold. For the next several hours, the brothers poured beer on him. They did a sternum rub to try to revive him, and if you don't know what a sternum rub is, it's apparently very painful. If you know medical, emergency stuff, it's supposed to wake someone up. Well, he didn't react to it. They slapped him, they backpacked him, they sat on him, they held him down on the couch. He came in and out of coherency, and several brothers knew he needed help, and they sought to seek it. but they were overruled by leadership. Guys just like you, who probably sat in a room just like this months before. At some point, all the brothers went to bed, leaving Tim alone in the lower level of the house, and he is seen stumbling around, falling many times throughout the night, writhing around in pain on the floor in severe pain. And at some point, Tim got back up and went towards the basement again, and that was the last time any video of him was seen. The next morning, he was found curled up in a cold basement, no shirt, and in the fetal position, stiff and turning gray. For the next 45 minutes, the leadership debated what to do, and they ordered a cleanup of the house while they tried to dress him, and they let him lie there as they were watching him slowly die right in front of their eyes. Finally, someone called 911. There was no mention of the fall. There was no mention of what happened during the course of the night. An ambulance took Tim to the hospital by himself. No fraternity member accompanied him. No family members were even called, and they knew that he had a brother on campus.
So now I want you to put yourself in our shoes. Who here has a brother or sister close in age to them? Close enough to be in college at the same time? If not, picture your best friend and consider that you're both going to the same college. Now, close your eyes and imagine that your brother's going to pledge a fraternity, and it started last night. You get a call from your brother's roommate saying he didn't come home last night, and that's not like him. He always comes home. You decide something's wrong and call the hospital to see if he's there. They say, yes, there's been an accident. Come right away. You rush to the hospital and see your brother on life support, neck brace, bruises and blood on his body and head. The doctor tells you it's bad, that he has a subdural hematoma, which is bleeding in his brain. His spleen is ruptured, actually shattered. He has a punctured lung, and he needs a blood transfusion because, as it turns out, 80% of his body's blood is in his abdomen. You have to call your mom to tell her that the doctor's going to call, but that your parents need to come now. You tell her what little information you know, that it was the first night of pledging, and that he fell down the stairs. They need to medevac him to a trauma hospital 1.5 hours away for neurosurgery immediately. You talk to him even though he's unconscious. You tell him to hang in there, that you are proud of him, and that you love him. A tear rolls down his cheek, and you think he heard you, and then they take him away. Now, picture your mom and dad getting that call, as well as the call from the ER doctor. The doctor says, he's a very sick boy, but they don't realize what he's hinting at, that their son is dying. Both mom and dad have to drive 45 excruciating minutes from work to get home, to pack bags, and then drive over 2 hours to the hospital where he'll be having surgery. Your dad says, this better not have anything to do with that fraternity, and your mom tells him it was the first night of pledging. They call the police to find out what happened. There's not a lot of information, but they say he fell down the steps once, maybe twice, after drinking. They get to the hospital and feel sick when they see the helicopter still sitting outside. They rush in and have to wait in the surgical waiting room. Finally, someone comes to take them to the surgical ICU to meet with the surgeons. It turns out this man is a chaplain, but it doesn't click why a chaplain was sent to get them. In a small room, a surgeon and a nurse tell them that their son's brain injury is non-recoverable. They feel the world stop. Another surgeon comes in and explains that once the skull was removed to release the pressure on the brain from the bleeding, the brain kept swelling outside of the skull, and that this is considered brain death. He's brain dead? How can this be? He's still on life support. Is there any hope for recovery? No. They have tests to prove brain death, but they can't be done because of his other injuries, and your parents have to take the doctor's word for it. You get a ride with your roommate to the hospital and find out how bad it is from your parents. You try to be the strong one. His girlfriend comes with her dad. They have to tell her that the boy she loves is brain dead. You all cry together. Then you finally get to see him. The only skin showing is his shoulders. He's covered with blankets to keep him warm, but his body won't warm up. His head is covered with a white gauze stocking cap to cover the bandages from having his skull removed to release the pressure on the brain from the bleeding. And he's got bruises and swelling on his face. He's on a ventilator. There are IVs everywhere and machines monitoring oxygen level and body temperature. They need to put chest tubes in his lungs because his oxygen level's dropping. They think he aspirated on vomit. The doctors and nurses tell you that they're doing everything they can, but that it's just a matter of time. He's going to go into cardiac arrest. The organ donor person is talking to you about donating his kidneys, the only organs not damaged. Now, you all have to decide whether to resuscitate him when he goes into cardiac arrest, potentially breaking ribs in his already battered body, only to know that he will go into cardiac arrest again. Or do you let him go into cardiac arrest and die so they can take him into an operating room and harvest his organs? Or do you turn the machines off now in an operating room and let him go so they can harvest his organs immediately? You, your parents, his girlfriend, and her dad decide to turn the machines off. But he codes before you can tell the doctors. And they resuscitate him as you watch from the hallway. A nurse pulls your mom forward and tells her to kiss her baby goodbye. He goes into cardiac arrest again, and you all let him go. You and the 10 medical personnel in the room who look at you with sad eyes. And there it is. He's dead. It's 1:23 a.m. A day and a half ago, he was alive and happy. How did we get here? How did this happen? What happened at that fraternity house? This doesn't make sense. He was a good kid. He wasn't a risk taker. He wasn't a drinker. He was a good student. He had a longtime girlfriend who he was planning a future with. He had great friends and roommates. He had plans for his future at school and for his career. What happened? He was an amazing person who was hazed. And then once he was hurt and unconscious, was slapped, had beer poured on him, had his shoes thrown at his head, was sat on to keep from rolling off the couch, was backpacked, and then ignored and basically left to die because the fraternity did not want to get in trouble. Think about this being your loss. Think about this being your pain. Think about having a funeral, having your brother cremated, and having to watch your mom put his urn in a niche at a mausoleum. Think about you losing your best friend, your only sibling. Why? Because he was hazed. Everyone's lives are forever altered, and there will always be this hole in your heart because he was hazed, got seriously hurt, and no one was willing to do the right thing and call for help for fear of getting in trouble.
The dignity and grace and strength that it must require to show up again and again to events like this and tell that story is beyond anything that I can imagine. This is the third time I've heard the Piazzas and the Gruvers share their story. And every time I react like this. It's so hard to hear. The first time I was angry. I heard y'all spoke for the first time at AFA when y'all came to the AFA conference, and I wanted to run through a wall. I was so mad. And I'm always sad because it's such a terrible story to hear. But the other feeling that I feel is just astonishment. I'm astonished at how this sort of thing could happen. And I'm still astonished. And as a researcher, the first time that I heard their story, it made me redouble my commitment to really helping answer a pretty simple question, which was, why did this have to happen? What were these people thinking? How could reasonable, responsible young adults, like the reasonable, responsible young adults in this room, allow something like this to happen? And it's a question that I've spent a lot of time rolling around in my head. It's a question that I've spent a lot of energy thinking about and hopefully trying to shed some light on. One of the things that we study in our work at Dyad Strategies, of which Phi Gamma Delta has been a very important part of this research and your commitment to taking surveys every year and helping us answer some of these questions. One of the things that we've really focused in on is something called hazing motivation, right? Groups haze their new members for different reasons. And if you ask anyone in your chapter, well, why do we do the things that we do to our new members? You're going to get some different responses. People think different things about what they're accomplishing, some more altruistic than others. The first one is this idea of education, right? Well, we're teaching you important things about the fraternity. You need to learn the history, and you need to learn the founders, and you need to learn the Greek alphabet. And so we're going to concoct all these crazy ways to hold you accountable for the things that you need to learn. So there's this kind of educational motivation. There's also a solidarity motivation, this idea that if we put you through something terrible as a group of pledges, as a group of new members, that you're gonna come together, right? This idea that we're building that bonded, unified pledge class, that if we put you through this difficult experience together, you'll build that bond, you'll build that brotherhood, and you'll come together to work together to achieve this common obstacle. The third one is this idea of loyalty or commitment, this idea that, well, if we put you through this really difficult experience, you're going to really feel more committed to the group as a result, right? That to whom much is given, much is expected, that if you have to work really hard to earn something, you're going to feel more loyal to it. You're going to feel more committed to it. So a difficult pledgeship will lead to more loyal, more committed members. And then lastly, and the most problematic of the bunch, is this idea of social dominance. This idea that what we do to our new members is designed to reinforce the hierarchy within the group. I'm up here, you're down here. I've got power, I can make you do things. I can make you clean the house. I can make you run errands. I can make you clean my room. I can make you chug a bottle of pure grain alcohol. I can make you do whatever I want because I have something that you want, and I've got the power to make you do it. And the hazing's really designed to do nothing more, nothing less to reinforce that hierarchy. And those last two in particular, the loyalty, commitment motivation, and the social dominance motivation are, in our research, the most problematic in terms of other things that they're connected to, the severity of hazing that people would tolerate, binge drinking, alcohol use, a number of different things that we measure. And when I think of those two in connection with one another, I think a lot about Tim, and I think a lot about Max, and I think about what happened to them. Because those two working in combination, in tandem with one another, kind of makes sense from a standpoint of a conversation that I hear fraternity members have a lot. And that's this idea that it means a lot to be in a fraternity. It's a big deal to be in a fraternity. There are a lot of privileges and benefits associated with being a member of a fraternity. And we know that. And so we don't want new members to just come in and take that from us. We don't want to just give that to them. We want to make them what? We want to make them earn it. Right? And when those two come together, that's really where that earn it mindset comes from. And you've heard your members talk about this. You've heard members of your chapter talk about this need for new members to earn their letters. And when we decide that the new member process is all about that, that's what leads us down a really dark path that leads to really bad things. And so I want to spend a little bit of time today helping you understand this notion of earning it and this notion of social dominance that plays out far too often in our chapters. And I'm not going to throw a lot of data at you, but I do want to share one data point. What we've seen in the last couple of years, this is 4 years of data now that we have in Phi Gamma Delta. And what we've seen is that 2018, 2019, and the years leading up to the COVID epidemic, Phi Gamma Delta was actually a little bit lower than the average fraternity in terms of that social dominance motivation. So your members' attitudes around should pledgeship be about reinforcing that social hierarchy. And all the fraternities in our data set were hovering around a 2 on a 5-point scale. It's pretty low. And then what happened between 2019 and 2020 when COVID hit, for whatever reason, and I haven't really figured this out yet, but we saw across the board, every single fraternity, we're now working with 13 national fraternities, and in every single one in 2020, we saw this massive spike in social dominance motivation. This idea that pledgeship should be about earning it. Pledgeship should be about reinforcing the hierarchy. I'm up here, you're down here. I can make you do things. I have power over you. I have control over you. And we saw that spike in Phi Gamma Delta, and we saw it in all the other fraternities that we work with. And we've not seen, as we return back to normal in the fall of 2021, some hope that, well, maybe that will come back down to earth. Maybe that will come back down to pre-COVID norms. And you can see from this data, it didn't in Phi Gamma Delta, and it didn't in any of the other fraternities that we work with. For some reason, the pandemic and the shutdowns and the social distancing and the inability to maybe navigate our new member processes the way we're typically used to doing that caused this shift in thinking. That the pledge program is really all about earning it. It's all about power. It's all about we're up here, you're down here. And I've yet to really wrap my brain around why that is. What is it about the last 1.5 to 2 years that has caused this massive shift in the thinking of our members around what's the point and purpose of our new member process? And so what I want to do is I actually want to give you all a chance to discuss this for just a minute at your tables. And I've got 2 questions that I want you to talk about. One, help me understand, why do you think this is happening? Why have we seen in the last 2 years this spike in social dominance motivation? Why are people now so much more obsessed with this idea of earning it than they ever were before? And then secondly, being honest with yourselves and honest with the other people at your table, how have you seen this spike play out in your chapter in the last year? Spend just a few minutes at your table discussing the answer to those questions. It's very scary. We saw it immediately in January. The first time we gathered data post-COVID, it showed up and we were like, what is this, right? I mean, and there were other spikes in alcohol use, which were expected. Everyone was drinking more. There were things that were kind of like, okay, that makes sense. But then this one was like, that doesn't make any sense at all. We had no idea where it came from. And still, there's some theories out there, but I'm going to be curious to hear what they say. All right. I really appreciate the good conversations that are happening out there, and I don't want to interrupt them, but in the interest of time, I need to. I'm really interested in hearing, I'm not going to ask you to share your answer to the second question because I want to respect the privacy of the conversations you had at your tables, but I'm actually very curious. All of us on stage are curious about any good answers you came up to the first question. Why do you think this is happening? If you would raise your hand if you'd like to share what you all discussed at your table, and Todd will come around and bring the microphone. Why do you think we've seen this spike in kind of this social dominance, earn it mindset?
One of the things that we talked about was a lack of control during this pandemic. People can't control the disease and what's going on around them. And when you have that much lack of control in one part of your life, you then want to extend it in another part. And so kind of like what we see with child abuse, is that you can't control maybe work or something, so then you overly control the other aspect. And so in this sense, brothers then want to have this control over other people so that they do have some sort of power within their life.
It's fascinating. Every time I ask this question, I've heard that answer. And the first time I heard it, I kind of discounted it, like, oh, I don't know if that's it. But it keeps coming up. So clearly there's something to that. I think there's definitely some notion of control that's part of the equation here. Thank you for sharing that. Up here.
So at our university, we have a discussion each semester called Collegiate Issues, where we talk about hazing. And this last one, he talked about this very interesting concept of how hazing is a cycle at a university. So it could start with a chapter maybe being a little lower status socially on the campus. The big fish fraternity gets knocked off for whatever reason. And then, you start getting some of those recruits that they wouldn't get. You start building social status until eventually you're at the top. And then those people who got to the top, they end up graduating or leaving for whatever reason. And so the new people already come in with almost this sense of entitlement, because it's the top, you're the top fraternity on campus, you got all the social status you want. And then at that stage, it becomes, well, we want to keep this social status, so we gotta, make sure that people who are coming in are worthy. I think in the context of the pandemic, it shook up the board for everyone. No one knew what they were doing, and it was a whole year of just, how do we operate, how do we function? The whole social, status got completely shaken up. Some chapters came out of COVID stronger, some didn't. And I think because of that, those chapters that might have been at the top that didn't come out so well, or even if they did, had, that's where that earn it mindset came into play, where it was like, well, we want to stay at the top, or we're, trying to get to the top, and we got to make sure that the people coming in are worthy enough for whatever reason.
When I get to that slide here in just a second, I'm going to have you come up here and teach the model, okay? So it's interesting that he says that. We saw a number of things shift during the pandemic, some not surprising. Alcohol use went up, but it went up everywhere, right? So it wasn't just fraternity members. Everyone was drinking more during the pandemic. One of the things that we measure, and I didn't share it, but to his point, was this idea of social status importance, right? That how much you care about your chapter's place in the social pecking order. Do you think that went up or down during the pandemic? Went up significantly, right? People care a lot more all of a sudden about their chapter's position in that relative social pecking order, and we know that they're correlated, right? We know that this social dominance motivation strongly correlated with that idea of social status and prestige and that earn it mindset. And I'm going to share the model that you all probably talked about. At what campus are you at? University of Akron. Awesome, yeah, for sure. Do one more. Anyone else want to share what they discussed at their table? Yeah, up here.
One thing we noticed in our chapter is there's a Brotherhood Survey that we've done earlier in the year. And a few of these questions have to do with what will our members tolerate before being willing to leave the chapter or de-pledge or anything like that. And something we've noticed is that the bar went a little higher for what you're willing to tolerate before you're leaving the chapter. And I think where that comes from is the number of options you have for social engagement during the pandemic decreases. So maybe you're more desperate for that. You're willing to tolerate a little bit more in order to achieve that. So that's one thing we've noticed in our chapter, and it makes sense for other chapters as well.
Absolutely. Really, really appreciate you all sharing your thoughts on that. So this is a real phenomenon. And as leaders in your chapter, it's really important that you understand the implications of this phenomenon. Your members care a lot more about this idea of making your new members earn it. They care a lot more about these notions of power and control. They care a lot more about the social prestige of your chapter and how that gets all tied up in this notion of pledging. It's really important for you to understand this phenomenon, and it's really important for you to understand what this means for you as a leader in your chapter. And so I want to spend the next few minutes just kind of talking about what we know about social dominance and what maybe you can take out of this to think through how you can go back to your chapter and really think through how you're going to address this and make sure that you get things back to where they need to be. And there's a lot of research that can shed light on these phenomenon. One of the big myths out there related to hazing is this idea that, well, you know, it's not really hazing because the new guys kind of knew what they were signed up for. You know, they kind of knew what they were getting into. And I've heard people talk about this. You've heard people talk about this in the criminal trials of those who were charged in the murder of your sons, who said, you know, Tim could have walked out of that house at any point. A chapter advisor of another fraternity at LSU I tweeted something out. I guess he follows me on Twitter. I found out he's an advisor for another fraternity at LSU, tweeted an article about Max, and he replied, yeah, Max was a grown man who could have left at any time. And it just enrages me when people say that. But we've built these myths up that some people truly believe that what happened to Tim and Max was not hazing, or even worse, was their own fault, that they could have left at any time. Why wouldn't they have left? What does the research tell us about that? How many of y'all have ever heard of the Stanford prison experiment? Raise your hand if you're familiar with the Stanford prison experiment. Pretty widely known in popular culture. It's come under criticism in recent years, but there's some really important lessons from the Stanford prison experiment that we can learn. If you're not familiar, quick overview of SPE. Psychologist named Phil Zimbardo was at Stanford University. This is in the late 70s. Got a grant from the Department of Defense to study prison, and particularly how prisoners break down in prison. They were interested in, this was actually a grant from the Department of Defense, so they're interested in interrogation and kind of psychologically breaking people down. And so Phil Zimbardo gets money, gets this grant from the Department of Defense to do this study. And instead of studying actual prisoners at an actual prison, he decides to create a simulated prison experiment. So they literally convert the basement of the psychology building into a prison, bars, cells, the whole 9 yards. And he goes out and he recruits students, puts an ad in the paper. Students go through, kind of an interview process, a psychological evaluation. No sociopaths, no psychopaths, just college students who needed a little extra money over the summer. And once he selected the students, and he selected 16 students to participate in the study, 8 of them were randomly assigned to be the prisoners, and the other 8 were randomly assigned to be the guards. And the guards were given very few rules, right? But they were given a couple. One, it's a prison. You got to keep them here. You got to treat it like a prison. You can't just let these guys come and go as they please. Number 2, you can't physically harm them in any way. But that was it. Beyond that, the guards were left to run the prison however they wanted to. And you can see in the images, I mean, it very quickly escalated. And if you've read the stories or watched the movies that have been made about it, you know what happened, that it was craziness, right? I mean, it was lineups and yelling and screaming and tossing their cells and sleep deprivation and food deprivation. They couldn't physically abuse them, but they did everything short of that, to the point that, long story short, the study was supposed to last for 4 weeks, and they ended it on the 4th day because the behavior of the guards had become so out of control that 2 of the prisoners suffered emotional breakdowns. So we ended up learning a lot more about the guards than we learned about the prisoners, and this idea of abuse of power. And we've all heard the quote, right, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the Stanford prison experiment really revealed kind of the darker side of human nature. But we learned 2 important things from the prisoners themselves when they were debriefing them after the study was over. They were talking, and what they learned, 2 important things. First, how many of the prisoners do you think actually went to the professor and said, yeah, I'm not really into this. They could have left at any time and were told, hey, at any point, if you want to leave the study, you can. You won't get paid the full amount. Not a single one of the prisoners went to the professor and asked to be released. And when they debriefed them after the study was over, what they found was that the prisoners had actually convinced themselves that they couldn't leave, that leaving wasn't an option. And I think about that a lot when I think about Max and Tim and just hazing in general, that you're there in that moment. You're in the room in the gauntlet, and you're about to walk in by yourself, and you're like, I could leave, but Gosh, just think of the emotional power that it would be required to say, yeah, I'm uncomfortable, so I'm just gonna leave. And most people in that situation don't, because they've convinced themselves that they can't, that I am here, I am with these guys, and we've got to get through this together. And that notion of solidarity and we've got to get through this together plays into this idea of why folks may not leave. So this idea that folks can just get up and remove themselves from a situation, it's not quite that simple. How many of you have heard of the Milgram experiments? Stanley Milgram. This one's a little less known, but to me, maybe some of the most fascinating psychological research that's ever been done. Stanley Milgram came of age in the period immediately following World War II and was fascinated by the Nuremberg Trials, which, if you're a student of history, you'll remember were the war crimes tribunal for the Nazi officers after the war. And all of these guys, when they were brought into the Nuremberg Trials and asked to answer for the horrible things that they had done, do you remember what their common defense was, what they always said? I was just following orders, right? I was just doing what I was told. Not a bad person, not a horrible human being. I was just doing what I was told to do. And Milgram was fascinated by this. Is this really a thing? Are people really willing to engage in abject evil just because a person in a position of authority told me to do it? And so he set up this research to find out. He put an ad in the paper. He says, hey, we're doing the study of memory. Here's the office address. Come by the address. It'll take about an hour of your time. We'll pay you $10. So people respond. They showed up. You go into the office. You sit in a waiting room. You fill out some paperwork. And there are other people in the waiting room, right? And so when they come and call you into the back, they always call you in with another person. You assume that other person showed up just like you did, but they're actually what's called a confederate. They're part of the research. They're part of the joke, but you don't know that. So you're taken back into the exam room, and you're told that you are going to be the teacher, and this other person is going to be the learner. Remember, the learner's kind of in on the act. He's a paid actor. You don't know that, though. You're given this list of pairs of words, and you're told that it's your job to read those word pairs to the learner, and it's the learner's job to say them back to you in the correct order. Seems pretty simple, right? But if you can see in the image, it's kind of a grainy old black and white photo. This is the learner. This is the guy. This is the paid actor, and he's getting strapped into a chair, and you can see there are electrodes being strapped to his wrist. And you're told that every time he misses a word, it's your job as the teacher to press the button on the electric shock machine that administers a shock to him anytime he messes up. And you're also told that every time he messes a word up, the voltage gets turned up. So it starts out very low, around 5 volts, and then it progressively gets worse and worse and worse, all the way up to 250 volts. And here's how the research would play out. You'd go through and you would miss the first one and you'd hit the button, and it's a little jolt, but it's not too bad. But then after 4 or 5 times, you realize, okay, I'm really hurting this person. And oftentimes, about this point, people would stop. And they would turn to Professor Milgram, and that's him there in the foreground. I like to imagine him in like a white lab coat and a clipboard, looking very professorial. And people would stop and they would turn to him and they would say, hey, I feel like I'm hurting this person. I'm not sure that I want to continue. And anytime anyone would do that, he would always say the same thing. He would just say, please continue. The research requires that you continue. Please continue. So people would go on a little bit further. Voltage keeps getting turned up and up and up. Eventually, the actor, he's screaming. He would convulse. His eyes would roll back in his head. He would start foaming at the mouth to the point that you think, my God, I'm going to kill this person. And so again, often towards the end, people would stop and they would turn to Milgram and they would say, hey, if something bad happens, will I be held personally responsible? And Dr. Milgram would say, nope, we assume all liability for the study. Please continue. What percentage of people do you think went all the way up to 250 volts? Any idea? If you've read the research, you know that the answer is around 70% of people went all the way up to 250 volts because a guy in a white lab coat was telling them to. And what Milgram was studying, and there's actually a book, if you're into psychology and a nerd like me about this stuff, you can actually read a book that summarizes all of his years of research. The title of his book is Obedience to Authority. And that's really what he studied. was this idea of obedience. Do people really do things just because an authority figure tells them to do it? And what he found in his years of research is that, yes, this is a real thing. Why is that? Why do we listen to authority figures? Why do we do what they tell us to do? Sometimes it might be because they have power over us, right? If I don't do what my boss tells me to do, he can fire me, right? In a fraternity, who are the authority figures? Well, if I don't drink this handle of alcohol that they've given me, they can kick me out. So this idea of consequences is part of it. But the other part of why we listen to authority figures is that we trust them. We trust them. Think about the authority figures in your life, the people who you listen to. Your boss, you trust that your boss has your best interests at heart. Your teachers when you were growing up, your parents, your coaches if you played a sport, you trusted that these people cared about you and had your best interests at heart. And again, I think about this a lot when I think about Max and Tim, that they trusted the people that they were with, that they wouldn't let something bad happen to them, that if they had an accident and fell down the stairs, that they would immediately call 911 and would do the right thing. There was trust there, that nothing bad is going to be allowed to happen to me. And so we do things even that we wouldn't normally do. We listen and we go along because we, A, may fear the consequences, but B, we trust people. And just because I didn't remove myself from the situation, just because I didn't leave the house, doesn't mean that I was okay with what was going on. The last little bit of research I want to share with you will actually demonstrate. I'm going to put 4 lines on the board. Easy question. I'm going to ask you to tell me which line is the longest, okay? So we got line number 1, line number 2, line number 3, and line number 4. So we'll do this by show of hands. Give them a good look. How many would say line number 1 is the longest? Line number 2? Just about everybody. Line number 3? Line number 4. Well, congratulations. It looks like almost everyone got it right. The way this research would work out, a guy named Solomon Asch, also a psychologist back in the late 60s, similar deal. Put an ad in the paper. Hey, show up. You come here. You show up in the waiting room. You fill out some paperwork. And this time when we call you back into the exam room, we'll take you back with 3 other people. So there's 4 of you total. And again, you assume the 3 other people showed up and responded to the ad just like you. But nope, they're part of the study. They're in on the joke, but you don't realize that. Taken into the exam room, and Dr. Asch would be there. And this is before PowerPoint. He had one of those old overhead projectors with the clear plastic sheets. You remember those? And he would have these 4 lines, and he would put them on the screen. The 4 people are set in 4 chairs, and the 3 Confederates are in the first 3 chairs, and then you, the research subject, you're always in the 4th chair. And so he would say, okay, which line is the longest? And he would start with the person in chair number 1, and they would give the wrong answer. Then you go to the person in chair number 2. They would also give the wrong answer, the same wrong answer. Person in chair number 3 would give the same wrong answer as the other 2. And then it gets to you, person in chair number 4. And what he wanted to find out was how often the person in chair number 4 would disagree with the group and give the correct answer versus go along with the group and give the incorrect answer. And what he found, very similar to Stanley Milgram, was that around 70% of the time, the person in chair number 4 would give the incorrect answer and just go along with the group. And what he was studying was really the first to study was this idea of conformity. And we've now seen this in a lot of other ways. I love that there was a show on TV, I forget which channel it was, What Would You Do? And it's like kind of real life scenarios, and you find yourself, and the classic one is, you walk into an elevator and everyone's faced the wrong direction, right? And what do? And people walk in, they're like, well, shit. And so they turn around backwards because everyone else is. It's this idea of conformity that we tend to, as human beings, just kind of go along to get along and take the path of least resistance. And so whatever group we're a part of, we just kind of go with the flow. And I may have a real problem with something that someone's asking me to do, but I look around me and no one else seems to have a problem with it, right? So the idea that I'm going to just get up and leave or remove myself from that situation, it's not quite that simple. So this is how, and this is really why social dominance is such a problem in our chapters. That your members have authority over the lives of these new members. And the suggestion that they do something, the directive that they do something, just because no one objects, just because no one gets up and leaves, just because they go along with it, just because they volunteer to go along with it, doesn't mean that it's not hazing. And I've even had people in your situation. I'll never forget, it was actually at LSU. It was not Phi Delta, it was a different chapter there, was walking through and talking with this fraternity president. This was several years ago. And he was saying, we'd gotten in trouble for hazing. And so our nationals came in, they did a big membership review, they kicked a bunch of people out, and we were on probation. And it was like, hey, one more strike and you're done, right? If you have any screw-ups with this pledge class, you're done. And he's like, so we did it by the book. He's like, all we did is, every Sunday night they would come to the house and we would go over the stuff from our new member manual, and we would go over everything and take a test over the material from the previous week. And he's like, on home football game weekends, the pledges would help set up and break down the tailgate. And that was it. There was no errand running, there was no cleaning, there were no lineups, we didn't do any of that. And he's like, we got through the process, no problem, and we initiated our guys. And he's like, after initiation, several of the pledges came up to me, and do you know what they said? I said, what? I knew what he was about to say. They said, we wish you'd hazed us more. I just paused and I thought about it for a second. And I asked him, and I'll ask you the same question. What do you think those guys actually meant? When they said, we wish you'd hazed us more, do you think they meant that they wished they'd been hazed, or do you think they meant something else? What I think they meant was something else. What they wished was that their new member process was meaningful. And the mistake that this chapter made was that they just stripped out all the meaning. They made it easy. It didn't bring them closer together as a pledge class. They didn't learn anything. They didn't feel a sense of accomplishment. They stripped away all the meaningful stuff. And it's like, well, yeah, we're just going to kind of, make you take a few tests and set up a few tailgates, and then you'll be done. I think that's the reason that a lot of groups haze. It's because it's the easiest way to make the new member process meaningful. You don't have to have a PhD in psychology to line the pledges up on the wall and scream at them and hand them alcohol to make them drink. It's the easiest way to create a meaningful experience. And at the end of that, the only thing that it will accomplish, and this really is the only thing, Rob was right. When you look at a chapter that hazes, the outcomes of that are terrible. But the one thing that hazing does is that at the end of that, if you make it through, it's like, all right, yeah, high five, we made it through. There's a sense of accomplishment. But how long does that actually last? And that gets to the cycle that you talked about a minute ago that we're going to spend some time talking about. So what can we do about this? What can you do about this? You go back to your chapters. You've heard these stories. You know it's a problem. We all know it's a problem. What do you do about it? First thing I'll say is this: fix your broken windows. And what I mean by this is not your literal windows, although if your house looks like this, that's a conversation we need to have. But if you lived in a neighborhood where all the houses looked like this, what other things might you expect would be going on in that neighborhood? Crime, drugs, robbery, right? Not the sort of place you want to walk through by yourself at night, right? The idea being that if you don't take care of the little problems, you eventually have big problems, right? If you don't fix your broken windows, eventually they become big issues. And I think about hazing in the same way. Hazing exists along a continuum, right? 1 to 10, right? So down here we got level 1, silly stuff, errand running, that sort of thing. Nothing dangerous, but it's technically hazing, right? It's technically hazing. And then down on the other end, level 10, you've got what you heard about earlier, right? Extreme forced alcohol consumption, extreme physical abuse, the worst of the worst that everyone can agree is hazing. And you've got kind of everything in between. Every single one of your chapters, you've got a place on that continuum where you draw the line. And you say, okay, well, yeah, we'll do some of this stuff down here, but we're not gonna do that. And if you're honest with yourself, where most of your chapters will draw the line is more up here around level 7, level 8. And the way we categorize this is we'll say, we don't want to hurt anybody. So we draw the line just short of hurting someone. Now here's a problem with that. If left to its own devices, that line is a living, breathing, moving thing. It moves over time. In which direction do you suspect that it moves if left to its own devices? Right? It moves this way. It gets worse over time. Of the groups in your chapter right now, the classes, we assume freshmen are joining, so they're the ones who are getting hazed. So your sophomores, your juniors, and your seniors. As a chapter leader, who do you worry about the most of those three groups? Someone doing something stupid and crossing the line? Sophomores, yeah, always the sophomores. Why? They just went through it, and now it's their turn, and so they're going to give it back just as much as they got, but they want to add their own little twist. They want to make it a little bit tougher. And so again, left to its own devices, over time that line gets worse. So the problem to me seems pretty obvious, that if you draw the line in your chapter just short of hurting someone, what's inevitable? Hurting someone, right? It's only a matter of time. So my advice to you is this: wherever that line is drawn in your chapter, start pushing it back. You may not be able to get from 7 down to 1 or 2, but if you can get from 7 down to 5 in your year in office, that's a big win for your chapter. So you can sit down and examine, what are the most dangerous things that we do? What's the most dangerous night of our pledge process? And what are the most dangerous aspects of that night? And how can we make that night less problematic, less dangerous? You, as a leader in your chapter, you need to have that conversation with someone. It may not be your campus Greek advisor. You may not have the relationship. It may not be your leadership consultant. Maybe your chapter advisor, an alum, a volunteer, your parents. Talk to someone about that question. Think about the most dangerous nights of your process and say, what are the most dangerous elements? Let's do a risk analysis. How can we make those less dangerous? Can we get from a 7 to a 5? And then next year when we have this conversation again, can we get from a 5 down to a 3? And then the year after, right? And we slowly push that line back. And that line's always going to be somewhere on that continuum. Hazing it's part of human nature. It's part of who we are. We're always going to be fighting this fight. But if we're fighting it down here at level 1, level 2, instead of up here at level 8 or level 9, we're winning because we're not going to have more families having to sit up here and share and tell their story. You've got to push that line back in your chapter. Does model look familiar? Is this what you were talking about a minute ago? Avoid becoming a victim of your own success. This is the other thing that you can do. How many of you would say that on your respective campuses, your chapter is in that top tier socially on campus? Raise your hand. How many of y'all are in top tier chapters? It's okay. Yeah, be honest. Like there's nothing wrong with being top tier. Yeah. How many of you would say you're like top of the middle tier? You're very close to being top tier, but you're not quite there yet. How many of you would say, oh, we're upwardly mobile? We're kind of down here. I would never say bottom tier. That would be rude. But right, you're aspirational. You have aspirations of being middle tier one day. Here's what we know about that tier system. As I shared earlier, your members care a lot more about it now than they did a couple years ago. Huge spike in the last couple years in Ashland. We've seen the same thing in Phi Gamma. There's this cycle. Raise your hand if a fraternity has been closed on your campus in the last couple of years for hazing or related activities. Almost every hand in the room is up. My guess is that chapter was a top tier chapter. Most people on campus would have called it top tier. It's not the rule. There are exceptions to the rule, but almost always a chapter that gets in trouble for hazing, certainly to the point of it being high-level hazing, is a top-tier chapter. Why is that? Because usually only pledges of top-tier chapters will go along with some of the more extreme stuff. If you're joining a group that doesn't have much social clout, there's only so much you're going to be willing to tolerate before you leave, and eventually you're going to say, well, this is not worth it, right? Like, this group doesn't have that much social status. They don't have that much clout. This is dumb. I'm leaving. But if you're joining a top-tier group, right, it's like, well, my life is going to be great after I make it through, so I'll just suck it up and tolerate anything in order to make it through, right? So what will happen is that eventually, for those of you who said, well, you know, we're middle tier, we're not quite top tier yet. You top tier groups are already there. Those of you who are on your way, eventually more of those top tier groups will get closed, and then you're going to wake up one day and you're all of a sudden going to be top tier because all those groups ahead of you have been closed and shut down, and they maybe come back and they recolonize, but they start over at the bottom. And so you wake up one day and realize that you've made it, right? We're top tier. And that's when a funny thing happens. And some of you have already probably started noticing this in your chapter. When you become a top tier chapter, the motivations of the people who join your chapter change. They're joining you because you are a top tier chapter. They may not like you. They may not have any respect for you as an organization or your values or what you stand for. They may not feel any particular sense of belonging or connection. They just want to be able to exploit the benefits associated with being in a top-tier group. And so that's why they join you. And then you pretty quickly catch wise to this. You realize that this is happening. We can't let them take advantage of us like this, right? We can't let these guys come in here and exploit us like this. We've got to do what? We got to make them earn it. And that's where this earn it mindset starts to work its way into your chapter. When you realize that new members are joining you just to exploit the social benefits. And so that's where the hazing begins. And it's certainly, if the hazing was already going on, this is where the hazing escalates, right? It's where it gets much worse. And so members begin earning it during your new member process. And you use this word entitled, and I love that word because that's exactly what happens. When you make your new member process all about entitled, all about earning it, what sorts of active members do you produce? The word entitled is the one that always comes up, right? Because they've earned it as a pledge, and now that I've made it through, I can just sit back and reap the rewards of that which I have already earned. I don't have to work hard. I don't have to do community service. I don't have to show up for chapter meetings. I don't have to do anything that I want to do because I earned it as a pledge, and you can never take that away from me. And so then these chapters look around and they're like, oh my God, we've got all these lazy, entitled members. This is terrible. What are we going to do? I know we must not be hazing them hard enough, and so the hazing gets even worse, and then eventually it becomes so bad that something bad happens. The chapter gets closed. A new chapter moves into the top tier, and the process repeats itself. Avoid becoming a victim of your own success. If you're on the precipice or if you already are a top-tier fraternity on your campus, you've got to resist the urge to make your new member process all about earning it. The people who, by the way, are the most committed aren't the people who earned it as pledges. You know the thing that we measure in our research that predicts commitment better than anything? It's a thing called sense of belonging. The extent to which I feel connected and valued and appreciated and feel like I have real, deep, meaningful relationships with the people in my chapter. Make your new member process about that, building meaningful relationships, and not about any of this other stuff. If you listen to nothing else that I say, listen to this. Just get hard alcohol out of your pledging process. Get it. Don't ever put your new members in a situation where they feel compelled to drink large quantities of hard alcohol. It's the single dumbest thing you can do. And it astonishes me that there are so many college students that have heard these stories. How many thousands of students have you all spoke to in the last 4 years? It's got to be over 100,000 students at this point. That there are chapters out there that still think that providing hard alcohol is okay, that it's a good idea. Just don't do it. And I hate the term, my new mission, I want to get rid of the term forced alcohol consumption. You hear that a lot. I hate the term forced alcohol consumption because it implies physical force. I don't think anyone held Max or Tim down and forced the alcohol down their throat, right? They willingly drank, but we've talked about all the reasons that they did that. Don't ever put your new members in a situation where they feel like drinking alcohol is something that they need to do in order to fit in order to continue in the process. Just don't ever put them in that situation. Don't do it on Big Brother night. Don't do it on initiation night. Don't do it on any night. Never put them in that situation. And if you do only that, you've made your new member process exponentially safer. Don't ever put your new members in that situation. Coach like this guy, big game coming up Monday night. Are the Alabama guys here? Yeah, roll tide. All right. I spent 5 years. I was director of Greek life at Alabama for 5 years. My PhD's from Alabama. I'm a Tennessee guy, born and bred, but I'm a roll tide guy when they're not playing the Vols. So, coach like Nick Saban, what do I mean by this? Here's the thing. I actually don't have a problem with the concept of earning it. What I have a problem with is the things that we do to make our new members earn their membership. Because it has nothing to do, oftentimes, with what we actually expect out of them as members. How much you can drink, how long you can hold a wall sit or bows and toes, or how long you can stand there and let someone verbally berate you has absolutely nothing to do with what it means to be a good member of Phi Gamma Delta. So coach like this guy, is it easy to get a spot on Nick Saban's football team? No, you got to be a 4 or 5 star to even get looked at. But even if you get a scholarship and even if you come to the team, it's no guarantee that you're ever going to play. right? The college football teams are littered with guys who transferred out of Alabama who just couldn't cut it, right? So how do you earn your spot on Nick Saban's football team? If you're a wide receiver, how do you earn the right to play? You work really hard in practice. You run good routes. You work on breaking tackles, yards after catch, right? All that. And eventually, right, you get the opportunity to play. And everything that Nick Saban does in preseason camp and in his practice throughout the year, much has been written about the process, right? Nick Saban's process. Everything that he does has a point or purpose. Specifically with those wide receivers, it's around either teaching them the skills they need to be successful or giving them opportunities to demonstrate and hone those skills. What if you approach your new member process with the same mindset? That everything you do is designed to either teach them something important or to give them the opportunity to practice and demonstrate their alignment with this stuff, right? All the stuff that we say that we're about. And it doesn't have to be easy. It can be challenging. It can be difficult. And we can still make them earn it, but we can make them earn it in a way that builds positive qualities and doesn't just reinforce all the negative behavior. The last thing I'll share is this, and then we're going to stop and do some Q&A, is take off the mask. And here's what I mean by this. There's this shield or mask that a lot of fraternity members think that they can wear that separates them from reality. And this was really beautifully demonstrated in the Stanford prison experiment that I talked about earlier. When he was debriefing the guards after the study was over, kind of the ringleader of the guards. The guy, his picture was actually on the slide, the guy in the aviator glasses. He was kind of the Billy Badass. He was the one kind of continually coming up and pushing the envelope and trying to push things a little further. And they asked him, why were you such a bad guy to these prisoners? And they kept pushing this line of questioning. And eventually, in kind of exasperation, he just said, look, that wasn't me in there. That was me playing the role of guard. As if he was like an actor in a movie or a play. As if he were wearing this mask that kind of separated him from reality. And when I read that in Zimbardo's book about the Stanford prison experiment, I was floored because it reminded me of so many conversations that I'd had with fraternity members who got caught up in the same stuff and would say the same thing. I'm not a bad guy, but I was just doing what was done to me. This is just part of our tradition. This is just part of what we do. As if they're just playing this role in a play or in a movie. And the problem with that, and I don't have to point it out because you've seen with your own eyes, you can't say that what you're doing isn't real because I assure you the consequences are incredibly real. You don't get to separate yourself from reality. You don't get to say, I'm a good person who physically abuses people. I'm a good person who emotionally abuses people. I'm a good person who makes people drink dangerous quantities of alcohol. You don't get to have it both ways. You got to make sure your members take that mask off and acknowledge that what they're doing has very real consequences. And I believe that the people in this room are good people. And I believe that most of your members are probably good people. But we got to push them to be better. So with that, I want to invite Rob Caudill back up to the stage. Rob's going to facilitate a little Q&A to just help us kind of think through and learn and process some of the things that we've talked about. Rob?
Thank you, Gentry. So brothers, just a quick note. You might have just received an Academy app alert. We recognize we're past 10 o'clock. That was pre-programmed. We have no intentions of stopping this program. We'll adjust throughout the day. We are going to open the floor for some questions because I think there's some real experts with some real experience in front of us. But first, I've got a couple things I'd like to ask from those up here, and there's going to be some questions that I pose specifically to our guests, families. Some I pose to Gentry. Some I'll say, and I'll lay this down. Feel free to jump in with an answer. Okay. And of course, we're gonna have the opportunity to have you all ask a couple questions. Todd will be running around with the wireless mic here. So, my first question is really for any of the parents sitting here. As you think about these last several years and the experiences that you've had, the horrific experience you had, which started this journey, the way with which you've approached this tragedy in your lives and to really work to make it better. as a parent, what would you share with these young chapter leaders? What is the, if you're, or maybe from another way, if you had to, if you were in the position and your son was about to be a chapter president, like many of the men in the room here are, what is it you would tell him, knowing what you know today?
I'll start. If my son was going to be a leader in his fraternity, I would sit him down, and I ask all of you to do this. You're going to have to hold your first chapter meeting, right? So I'm going to help you do your agenda right now. So write it down. Your first bullet point, welcome them, thank them for their support, and thank them for their support in the upcoming year. Your second bullet point, hazing. Here's the lowdown, guys. If anybody in this chapter is involved with hazing, I am going to move to have you suspended or expelled. There's no discussion. That's it. Third bullet point, new member recruitment and initiation. And talk about ways that you're going to do that are positive. The rest of the agenda, you figure out for yourself, whether it be finances or whatever. But I ask that you put that hazing bullet point on your agenda, and there's no discussion. It's matter of fact. We're not going to do it. If you do it, I'm going to move to expel or suspend you from the fraternity.
I would say, I think a big thing which we've talked about quite a bit is you guys as exec boards definitely need to know, and as presidents, that like in Max's case, his exec board knew exactly what was going on with Matthew Notkin. They had had a meeting about Max, or not about Max, about Matthew 3 days before this Bible study. And the exec board all got together and they discussed how Matthew Notkin was dangerous and reckless with the pledges. He'd already gotten several drunk and throwing up over, toilets and shooting them at tailgates with pellet guns and, a bunch of stuff over these 3 weeks. And they knew he was a problem. And that exec board didn't stand up and be courageous enough to step in. And they talked about him. They could have done several things. And they said, you know what, we're going to talk to him tonight at the chapter meeting, and we're going to give him another chance. Well, that night they talked to him at that chapter meeting, and you know what Matthew Notkin said was, I can do whatever the fuck I want with these pledges. 3 nights later, he went out and did what he did to Max, and he killed my son. And that entire exec board is also liable and responsible for Max's death because they knew and they didn't take on their leadership role the way they should have. You guys are in these positions. You wanted these positions. I hope not just for a resume booster. I hope it's because you really want to be leaders and you want to step in and make these decisions. You have to make these decisions sometimes very, very quickly. And you need to get in there and stop something before it's, goes too far at all. So that's my biggest thing to any of you leaders is, again, you took these positions to be a leader. Be that leader. Have no tolerance for hazing. Set the tone, like Jim just said, right away. Set that tone that you are not going to tolerate it and that it's time for this change to happen now, not later. Because if you're hazing, something bad is going to happen. It's not an if it's going to happen, it's just when it's going to happen. So think about that, and that's what you need to relay to all of your chapters.
Steve, Evelyn, any additions?
It's with Max and, with hazing, I wasn't in a fraternity. I was very good friends with the Chi Phis at UNC Charlotte. I went to their formal. I was like an adopted brother, but I was never involved with any of what could have been hazing at that fraternity. What we learned from our experience is exactly how dangerous hazing is. And I think it's unfortunate that the news will only tell you when somebody dies from hazing. And therefore, you guys keep going on your hazing path thinking, that's not going to happen to us. It's just a couple kids a year. we're fine. And I can tell you that the Phi Delta Thetas, the morning that my son died, thought that they had their hazing under control and that it wasn't dangerous, and they killed my son. But there's so many other lives that are damaged from hazing that just don't hit the news. It's the kid that went to the hospital for alcohol and almost died, and now is dropped out of school and is suicidal. And this is an example that we know of. One of Max's friends this happened to in the state of Georgia. No one hears about that. It's that kid that left school that you ruined their life. And that's not what your fraternity is about. Gentry hit on it. You're about building relationships and making each other stronger. That's why you joined this fraternity. And those are the guys you need to count on to help you later on in life and build you up. So my words are, now I understand the dangers of hazing and what it can do to destroy an organization, as there are no more Phi Deltas at LSU. And that you have to understand how dangerous it is, and that you have to stop it. Do exactly what Jim said. Go back and do zero tolerance, because it's going to destroy lives and it's going to destroy your organization.
If I could just come over the top on something that Rae Ann said. If you guys are in these positions and you're not up for the challenge, you ought to really think about resigning, because you're putting yourself at risk, and you're putting other members at risk. Anybody here Spider-Man fans? Tim was a big Spider-Man fan. He used to dress up as Spider-Man to raise money for Thon, the dance marathon. And there's a quote that I always think about from Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. You guys are responsible. And if you can't accept that responsibility, you really should resign. It's not about a resume.
And I was basically going to hit on that. You have an opportunity. You have the opportunity to be the bright light in somebody's life. You can be in this adopted brotherhood. You know, you've gotten to choose your brothers. You can be that big brother. You can be that mentor, that guide. You can be the person that somebody looks back on later in life and says, wow, they made my experience there great. They were, you can be that person who somebody thinks back on fondly, who built them up and helped them and helped get them to a better place.
Thank you. And another question, and I think anybody can feel free to jump in. Also in our audience this morning is not just our undergraduate leaders, but some number of our alumni volunteer leadership, those that work most closely with our undergraduate chapters. In your view, what is it that are these young undergraduate leaders, right? And again, the majority of the undergraduates in the room have just assumed these positions or will very soon. What is it that they need from their advisors to help them stand up and take the bold step and to be these courageous leaders we all wanted them to be? What is it you think they need from the advisors in the room?
I think you have to be humble sometimes and understand that this leadership does take courage, but sometimes you need that coach to back you up and give you guidance, and understand that that's what these guys are out there for. So don't be afraid to pick up the phone, call them, sit down with them, and use them. They're a tool to help you be successful, and they're there to help you get your message out and create the change that's necessary at your chapter. So these guys don't volunteer to do this to destroy your organization. They're there to help you, and you got to use them. You got to reach out and understand that they're there to back you up. Use them.
Well, and they're there to help you with your problems. I mean, 100%. And if you have an advisor, and no offense to any of the advisors in here, if you have one that you don't think is helping you the way you need to be helped, I mean, you definitely need to talk to your headquarters right there. That's the man to talk to. And that happens. I think there was a big disconnect between Max's fraternity chapter and the advisor from things we've gotten over the years. And that could have been a huge problem with what was going on with that chapter. So again, those advisors are mentors. They're there to help you. They're there to help you work through, again, these tough decisions. If you guys know who your bad apples, as Steve says, are in your chapter, or you guys, I'm sure in your heads right now, can think of a couple guys that you're like, I got to watch these guys. Like, they could be this type of hazer or whatever. You need to talk to your advisors about that. This is the weekend to do it and figure out, what do I do with them before we get back this semester? How am I going to address this? Talk about it now. And again, like Steve said, be humble. It's okay to admit these things are going on. That's how you change them then in your chapter, right away, not a few weeks down the road and something bad may have happened. So, just be honest, be very honest. And the advisors too, you guys gotta, also step up and be really involved with these guys. And, I know there's a big thing we keep here too, like, oh, you're 18 and you're an adult. You could have walked away. Like, I'm not a big, huge believer in that. Yeah, I believe you guys in college, 18 to 22, you do need to mature and you need to do things independently. And obviously, get away from your mom and dad and all this, and these guys are there to help you. But you're not immediate adults the minute you turn 18 and 1 second year old, and one minute we want to treat you like that, and then the next minute we're like, oh no, but they're just kids. You know what, you're growing and you're learning, and that's what all these adults are here to help you with. So use them, and that's what's going to make you guys better men as you keep moving forward.
And being a good leader means knowing when you need some help. It means knowing when you need to go to somebody else. And that hierarchy exists throughout life. I mean, in every organization, there's various stages of leaders, but they have someone to go to. Even when you hit the peak and you're the CEO of a company, you have a board of directors to go to advise you when you need help. It doesn't make you weak. Being a good leader means you know when you need that extra help. So again, use these folks. That's what they're there for. Use Rob if you need to go to the highest level.
And Rob, I would share to the actual advisors in the room, of which I am one. I advise my own chapter, a member of Alpha Gamma Rho at the University of Tennessee. I think there's an assumption, anytime there's a hazing incident, that the advisors knew everything that was going on and were complicit with it. And it's my experience that more often than not, the advisors are just as surprised as everyone else is. Because you can't be there all the time, you're not aware of everything that happens, you're not there late at night, you don't know everything that occurs. But you probably know enough, right? You know about your own experience in the chapter, and that the conversation that I shared that chapter presidents should have earlier, advisors, you need to be part of facilitating that conversation as well. When I came back to advise my old chapter, I knew exactly what our most dangerous night of our new member process was. And the very first conversation I had when I sat down with our new member educator was, tell me about what happens at senior speeches now. Because I'd been away from the chapter for 15 years at that point. And I knew what it looked like when I left. It looked different, right? It had become more problematic. And so we had a very long conversation then with the executive board about, hey, senior speeches sounds like it's gotten a little out of control. What are some steps we can take to dial that back in? So if you know even what the traditions are or what the most potentially problematic nights are, do you do a big brother night? Is there a big post-initiation party? Is it something at the end of the semester? Is it something at the beginning? You may not know everything, but you know enough to ask some very pointed and guided questions and to work through with your chapter leadership what's going on those nights. What can we do to make those nights safer? Are there aspects of a tradition that we can preserve while also ensuring that we're not putting anyone in harm's way? Be willing to sit down and ask those tough questions and facilitate that conversation.
Thank you. I've got one or two more things I'd like to talk about, but first I'm going to ask Todd if he's ready. He caught the subtle cue. If there's anybody that has a question that they'd like to ask of the families of Gentry, please make yourselves known.
Thanks to all of you for being here today. It's been very powerful. I'm I'm a younger, graduate advisor, and even the differences between when I was in school just a few years ago and now, I mean, there are huge differences in pledgeship, right? It's a lot shorter, there's a lot more controls, but the thing that struck me about, the stories we hear today, it seems, to me at least, a lot of these dangers are happening early on because there's no relationship, or at least not enough of one, between the guys in the house and these, new members. And so when something bad happens, for me, one thing that sticks out of our issues of the last 18 months is a lack of empathy, right? And you have to know somebody to really feel empathetic sometimes, or you have to have a really high empathy. And I'm just curious, the Gentry, to the parents, it seems to me that even if you shorten pledgeship, some of the most dangerous parts are going to be at that beginning when they don't know these kids. And so when they see something happen, it's not my friend, it's this new guy. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts for guys in these rooms is, whether we're starting spring pledgeship shortly or they're already thinking about next fall when they're going to start and have the first class they're overseeing. How do you maximize that relationship from the beginning and work with guys to make them realize that these aren't just new guys that could join your chapter, but they're already part of the chapter, they're already people that you need to care about?
It's a great question, and it's a great thought. A couple things I would share. I referenced that the biggest driver of commitment is that sense of belonging, right? That the more people feel they have deep emotional connections with one another, the more committed they are to the chapter. Sense of belonging is also inversely correlated with that hazing tolerance measure that the young man here at the front table was talking about, basically where you would draw the line, which speaks to what you just said. If you've got meaningful relationships, it's harder for me to do mean things to someone that I consider a friend. It's hard for me to dehumanize someone that I know and know things about their life and know things about their background. Take advantage of the structures that you have in place in your new member process to invest really heavily in deep, meaningful conversation early in the process between the actives and the new members. A lot of chapters do interviews or signatures, and I don't know what Phi Gamma's official position on interviews or signatures are. They certainly can lead to hazing, but if done correctly, they can lead to meaningful relationships. Especially if we make these interviews not just a one-way interview, but when I'm a new member and I sit down to talk to a sophomore, junior, that I'm not only asking him meaningful questions about his life, but then he's turning around and he's asking me meaningful questions about mine, and we're finding common ground, and we realize we've dealt with some of the same things or struggled with some of the same issues or share some similarities in terms of our background. And then a couple of nights later, when I'm supposed to be hazing that kid, it's going to be a little harder to do, right? Because I've started connecting with him and I've built that relationship. So I think as you look at the structure of your process, the more that you can do early on to elicit vulnerable conversations that require people to really open up and share and connect in ways that they wouldn't just normally do. And, oh, what's your name, your hometown, your major, some of the basic stuff that often gets caught up in that process. If we can make that process work to our advantage by creating opportunities for those meaningful connections to happen, I agree with you completely. There's no reason to think it wouldn't cut down on some of the really dangerous stuff that we see in the process. That's a great question.
And I'm going to go back to basics on bullet point 3 when you're having that discussion about new member recruitment and initiation. Remind your brothers, we chose this group to be our brothers. We have to treat them that way from day one. We chose them. They went through a process. We chose them. It's no different than my firm. We hire hundreds of thousands of students off campus every year. When they walk through our door the first day, they are part of us. They are part of us. If you try to join a country club, once you're in, you're in. You're part of that country club. There's no test period or anything like that. You're part of that club. So remind your brothers, you pick these people. If you have a problem with one of them, say it before we bring them in, before we invite them in. But once they're in, we should treat them like our brother.
Well, and those new members chose you also. Like we say, during that rush period, you guys, there was a mutual respect and liking to each other because you chose them and they chose you. So again, I don't know why I always say this, after you give out that bid card, why when the new member period starts, we just had a great rush and everybody's, having a good time and getting to know each other. You hand a bid card over, and then the new member period, you start hazing them or treating them like shit because they got to prove themselves. Well, you guys proved to each other during rush that you had that respect for each other. So carry that on. And I agree with everything you guys said. You're not going to haze somebody you know and that you've gotten to know. It's going to be way harder. It's like a stranger that you're just going to be mean to, which isn't right either, but you know what I'm saying.
Anyone else who'd like to pose a question? We're going to try and do one more before we wrap it up. Okay, we see. We'll give it a second.
I also have a question for Dr. Gentry. In your experiments, you always talk about it's human nature to conform to others. Is there any research or qualities for the 30% of individuals that chose not to do that? And kind of like how can we bring out those qualities through our new member education program and make that more of a natural thing to kind of change people's perspective on it and allow more people to be comfortable stepping out of that zone?
That's a great question. One of the things we study, one of the items that when you all participate in the questionnaire every year, looks at conformity, right? So your willingness to just kind of go along with the norms, your willingness to just kind of do whatever. And I'm thinking off the top of my head, it's been a while since I've looked at that data, but I recall that a couple of things are strongly correlated and inversely correlated with that. And on the inverse side of the things that are inversely connected to conformity, in other words, what predicts something in a chapter culture or in an individual that would cause them to be less likely to conform. One of the big ones is the sense of accountability in the chapter. That if I'm in a chapter where I know that people are held accountable, that we have standards, we have expectations of what we do and how we do it, then there's conformity, but in a good way, right? I'm conforming to positive standards as opposed to this idea of just going with the flow and going along with everything. So I think creating, to Jim's point, really clear boundaries about what's okay and what's not okay. And not just setting those boundaries with the pledges, but setting them with the actives. It's interesting to me that a lot of new member educators will say things like, I tell the pledges, if anyone asks you to do anything that makes you feel uncomfortable, I want you to come talk to me about it. And anytime a pledge trainer or a new member educator says that, I'll always ask them, I'll say, well, how many people came and talked to you? And the answer is always, well, nobody, right? Because why not? Because you've left it up to the pledges to determine what's okay and what's not okay, what's in bounds and what's out of bounds. You got to be much more explicit with them, right? In terms of these are the things you should expect as part of this process. But if anyone does X, Y, or Z, if anyone tries to make you drink, if anyone tries to do anything physical, whatever it is, wherever you decide that line needs to be drawn, and hopefully it's further down, that needs to be explicitly communicated not just to the chapter, but to the new members themselves. With regards to the individual level, the biggest predictor of conformity that you can look at with prospective members, one of the things we study is motivation to join. And the guys who are the most likely to conform in a problematic way are the guys who are the most interested in your chapter's social benefits, right? So if I'm only interested in joining you because you're top tier or I want to exploit the social benefits associated with being in your group, then I'm much more likely to conform to the norms of that group versus if I'm looking to join for more altruistic reasons, a sense of belonging, leadership, and involvement. So I think doing a better job on the front end, screening who's joining and why they're joining, and doing everything in your power as a chapter leader and coming up with a system, questions you can ask, conversations that you can have with prospective members to weed out those guys who are only interested in the social aspect will yield a lot of positive dividends down the road. So just a couple of thoughts off the top of my head. That's a really good question.
We could probably have this conversation for quite some time this morning, but we recognize there are some other aspects of the Fiji Academy and a continuing conversation that we need each of you to have within your own officer groups. So with that in mind, if you'll excuse me, we're gonna start to transition here, but I do have one more question. I think that is a really important one. And I'm gonna ask you each to answer it for me. And it's really very simple. If there's one thing you want the men in this room to take away from this morning, what is that? Jim, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. The number one thing for me, and if you could drive it through your chapters as well as just yourself, if somebody needs help, get them help. Call 911. Don't wait. Don't take the pulse. Don't backpack any of that. Call 911. Get them help. There is no downside for calling help.
Evelyn?
Not to sound biblical, but you are your brother's keeper, and you've chosen each other. You need to look out for each other. You need to have each other's backs. You need to be concerned about somebody's emotional well-being or their health or their safety, and just keep that as a priority. You know, have respect. You don't have to be best friends with somebody, but have respect for somebody and know that they have a family who loves them and cares for them, and so just have respect.
I would say be the leaders that you are in this room and that you wanted these positions, and stand up and set the tone immediately, like we said, set that tone that hazing's not going to happen and that you are changing the ways that your chapter might be or your campus might be. And be leaders. Again, just be the leaders that you are in this room.
So, you know, I work for a company. We want our company to be strong. You guys are in this fraternity. You want this fraternity to be strong. You know, we hopefully hire the best people. You know, we go through interviews. Sometimes we make mistakes, and we have to make that hard decision to fire people. But before we do that, we do everything in our power to build them up and make them stronger and convert them to assets. We give them a chance to do it, but we have to be the leader and give them the tools to succeed. If you're allowing hazing in your organization, you're inviting in a cancer that will eventually destroy your organization. So please understand how dangerous it is, and how, do you want to have a criminal organization, or do you want to have a successful company, a successful fraternity? And that's really the choice when it comes to hazing.
And Gentry, remember one thing.
One thing.
One thing.
Trust and transparency goes a long way. If you've got a problem member, if you've got a bad apple, Jim and others have shared, zero tolerance, kick them out. I agree, and also sometimes that's easier said than done. And if you've got a member that you know you need to get rid of, or a handful of members that you know are causing problems, and your judicial board's not up to the task, or you can't get the votes to expel, and for whatever reason you feel disempowered, pick up the phone and call this guy and say, Rob, I've got a problem. I've got a few members that I just can't get a hold of. Can you come in and help us? And Rob is going to say, yes, we can. We value that transparency. We value the trust. And we're going to work with you to not come in and investigate and close your chapter down. We're going to help you fix your problem. And we're going to value the fact that you came to us and you wanted to partner with us. Partner and put a little trust in your fraternity, and they'll put a little trust in you.
Well, Gentry, I think just to add something to that, certainly you've described how I want to approach these situations very well. Phi Gamma Delta is not in the business of closing chapters. We are in the business of making our chapters stronger and of building courageous leaders, right? With that in mind, understand that what Gentry described is in fact a policy set by the Archons. Phi Gamma Delta has an amnesty policy which essentially says, if you come to us with a problem and you admit we have been violating this aspect of fraternity law, of policy, and we are committed to make a change, there's no downside. But you've got to commit to make that change and understand that we are going to work with you through that. Okay?
That's great.
A few things I want to hit on real quick. There was a lot described which really resonated with me this morning, and I promise you we did not talk about in any of this what I'm going to describe. If you recall last night, I started setting the stage and saying, we need to make some changes. We need to start doing things differently and evolve our thinking so that we can ensure that the positive impact of fraternity continues for years and years to come. You heard a few key things, I think, particularly from Gentry, but from some of our guests as well. I want you to understand there are programs in place to help you start thinking about things differently. It is vitally important that we really rethink our entire joining process, that we rethink the approach we take to inviting men to join. By the time you hand a man a bid card, you should be fully accepted to call him brother. No ifs, ands, or buts. You should get to know him well enough that you're comfortable to do that. Guess what? We're rolling out this thing called a growth system to help you do that and to give you the tools, the technology, and the tools and the education you need to really do that legwork in recruitment, to know who's coming in the front doors of our chapter house. We need to rethink our joining process and rethink what new member education means. And Gentry described this beautifully. Thank you for this. We might have actually stolen this from you as we developed it 3 or 4 years ago. If you have not heard about the program or are currently piloting with us Foundations of Courage, talk to a staff member today. Foundations of Courage is our new approach to new member education. There is no requirement in the Phi Gamma Delta laws that says to be initiated, you must memorize the Immortal Six. I dare you to find it for me. The new member education period is about building those relationships in a positive and productive way. That is what Foundations of Courage does. That is what it's about. These are programs we're rolling out, programs we think are going to be very important. You will be hearing much more about throughout the course of the weekend. Brothers, it is time to set the wheels in motion and think about things differently. We are in a transformational era. And we're going to look back and say, you know, it was hard, but wow, it was good that we did it. So I want to close by also leaving you with a thought that some of you have heard from me in the past. As we think about our values, these words that are on the pillars behind us here, I think when you think about what makes fraternity, it's friendship. And those friendships are all developed, and they're all part of relationships. And a lot that goes into friendship that's really more, and brotherhood is really more than just being friends, right? But in the context of relationships, it's all about how we're treating each other. And if we just are a little bit more deliberate in how we treat each other, so many of our problems will be gone. Who's heard of the golden rule? Right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Here is my challenge to each of you. In Phi Gamma Delta, let's enact the platinum rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto your little brother, your sister, your mother, your best friend. If we treat others the way we want those closest to us to be treated, 90% of our problems will be solved. Jim, Evelyn, Rae Ann, Steve, thank you. It's difficult. I've got a 7-year-old. I can't imagine what you went through. We appreciate you telling your story in an impactful way to help us all be better men. Gentry, we appreciate you continuing your work and moving us forward. And a big thank you to Phi Delta Theta, who helped us arrange this weekend and get everybody here. So, brothers, we are going to continue with our Fiji Academy. Jade, I'm just going to steal your thunder here. We're going to continue with our tracks, and we're going to say we're going to start them in 10 minutes at 10 till 11 o'clock Central Time. Those tracks are going to continue on the list on the screen, if we can pull those up. They're also in the Socio app that's up and in your printed programs. Okay. Please be present in your sessions today. We're going to have some more deep discussions about how we really make Phi Gamma Delta stronger. We will be making the time adjustments this morning. Those will be communicated to you by your track facilitators. Brothers, have a good morning. We'll see you at lunch. Thank you again.